Please welcome Claude Aiken, Chief Strategy Officer at Nextlink, for his Operator Light Talk, Taking Rural Vitality Light Years Ahead.
Here in a small town where it feels like home, I got everything I need and nothing that I don't.
All right, I appreciate the energy. Fantastic. It's great to be here with you all today. Thank you, Jessica, for that wonderful introduction. I'm Claude Aiken, Chief Strategy Officer at Nextlink Internet, and today I am going to talk about three things: why rural broadband matters, why it's getting harder to serve those markets, and what we can do to make sure that both providers and the communities that they serve come out ahead. You may think that it's a little bit passé to say that rural broadband matters, because we've been talking about it for years, but when I started at the FCC back in 2008, yes, 2008, one of the first things that I worked on was the Rural Broadband Report, mandated by Congress to make the case for why rural broadband mattered. And I think we can all agree that it does matter today, but you know, it's crazy. As late as 2015, we had an FCC commissioner that referred to broadband as not a necessity for rural Americans. Now, I love Mike, we're good friends. I still give him a little bit about this statement. He's kind of come off that since then. But you know, now that we're 18 years, dozens of broadband funding programs, and one global pandemic later, the criticality of broadband for rural communities cannot be denied. In fact, very exciting, at Nextlink Internet, we just turned up our very first BEAD-funded piece of infrastructure this month. But you know, looking out on the audience, I see a lot of folks. I'm making an assumption here. I'm going to ask for hands. Who all here lives in what they would consider an urban or suburban part of America? Hands. Okay. All right. Good chunk of the room. So, particularly for those folks, I'm going to tell you, in rural America, three reasons why it matters. Matters for sleep, matters for kids playing with their friends, and it matters for family time. These are things that you don't necessarily think about when you're thinking about what broadband enables, but I'm going to tell you a couple of stories from folks who are served by our network. One farmer in rural Gage County, Nebraska, told me that our internet service helped her sleep at night. Obviously, I had to ask her to explain that a little bit. And she told me that tractors today are roving data centers. They're pulling and pushing incredible amounts of data to drive yields and success for farmers. Now, before she had service from us, she was on a bad satellite connection. And she, after driving her tractor into the barn, would have to stay up half the night to make sure that the data that she was relying on to make sure that her planning the next day was going to go well would actually work. When we brought her gigabit fiber, the upload just worked, and she was able to sleep at night. We also had a kid in rural Texas that wrote into our CEO thanking us for letting him play with his friends. Again, we kind of had to ask him what he meant by that, but he lived in a school district that's pulled from both suburban and rural areas. He lived in the rural area. A lot of his friends lived in the suburban areas. And when he was trying to play Xbox with his friends, his connection on a poor fixed wireless connection lagged so badly that his friends in suburbia stopped inviting him to games. He wasn't writing to thank us for internet. He was writing to thank us for not being the odd one out in his friend group anymore. And on that same Gage County fiber that I talked about earlier, we had a story of how our broadband service enabled better family time. There was a nurse whose husband was a farmer who commuted into Lincoln, Nebraska every day and had to stay late after hours to finish her charting because she didn't have reliable internet at home. Now she's able to chart from home after her kids go to bed. She doesn't miss their evening games anymore. She doesn't miss their practices. We talk in big terms about why this matters: energy, education, healthcare, government, public safety, all real, all critical. But underneath those verticals are these basic human moments: sleep, kids, family time. And yes, that is a real picture of a baby in a combine harvester sleeping while her mom harvests corn. So those are the reasons why it matters, but rural broadband is hard, and it's getting harder. We all know it's capital intensive. Rural fiber passings can run tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars to build, and they're not cheap to maintain. Locations that don't have fiber today are by definition the most expensive to serve, and in some cases, the maintenance costs alone can exceed the monthly revenue. Make no mistake, even under this BEAD program, we're going to see defaults under the weight of a 25% match and grant agreements that prohibit ongoing operating subsidies for this infrastructure. What we didn't talk about in all of the BEAD conversations is that most rural households solved their broadband dilemma during COVID. The market isn't a blank slate anymore. That means when we show up with a new build, the question is not only can we build it, the question is why should they switch? And speed and technology alone are not a complete answer. Even in highly rural markets where we've overbuilt with fiber, more than 25% of households typically don't take the service. That's consistent with Pew data showing that the adoption gap is real, it's persistent. And the metrics that matter most to customers that I talk to are not the ones that we talk about most on stage. The challenge that we're seeing with rural broadband today is that good enough is good enough. And that means price and reliability are key. We love flashy speeds and the press releases. Hey, we're guilty of it at our company too. But that's of secondary concern to a rural consumer. Customers experience broadband as outcomes. Can I afford it? Can I work from home? Can my kids learn? Can I live my life without friction? The provider who answers those questions the best is the provider who wins. What customers feel first, like I said, is their pocketbook. In an era of continuing inflation, cost of living increases, price is now one of the primary determinants of whether a customer stays with you or not. We've had more than one customer call us up on the phone crying because they loved our service, but someone else was offering it for cheaper. Next is reliability. Can they get quality connectivity across their home, across their yard, across their farm? Does the connection hold up when the day depends on it? Can the upload finish? Does the video call stay up? Does the service work at the moment that it matters? That's why we at NextLink pay super close attention to measures like uptime and churn. Our network runs at over 99.9% uptime, even with storms, and our churn is typically under 1%, even including moves. Those aren't just operating metrics, those are trust metrics. They tell you whether a family or business believes your network is dependable enough to build routines, work, and play around. What matters less is network speed and capacity. Across our network, the average household uses about 600 gigabytes of data per month. And typical busy hour demand is around 10 megabits per second. Yes, even on multi-gig fiber, the average rural family at peak hour is using 10 megabits per second. And that's almost identical whether the customer is connected over our fiber or over our fixed wireless. Now, that doesn't mean that speed is unimportant. It means that when customers buy is a connection that fits their budget and works for the applications that shape daily life. Good enough is good enough. And rural Americans are resilient. They've built their lives around whatever they have. Remember the nurse who couldn't chart from home? She didn't change her routine the day that we lit the fiber. She changed it the day that she finally believed that the connection would hold. The market's also getting a lot more competitive, even in rural America. We have seen, just in the past couple weeks, a rural subdivision with 4 fiber providers going into the joint trench with the electric utility. 4 fiber providers. Starlink's offering promotional service for $30 a month. Amazon Leo is on the way. The days when decent rural service automatically earned a customer are over. So what can we do to make sure that they adopt and that we survive? Said another way, how do we ensure that rural providers in the rural communities that they serve both flourish? What does a value proposition beyond technology look like? Start here. Every broadband success and every broadband failure is local. Solutions, sure, they can be national, but the impact only ever lands at the local level. It looks like investing in adoption, digital skills, local partnerships, and community anchor institutions. It looks like showing up as a community partner, not just a line into the home. A peer-reviewed study found that rural counties with broadband adoption of over 80% saw business growth of over 200%, GDP growth, per capita income growth, higher than low adoption counties. Adoption is where the long-term value shows up. And at Nextlink, we're big believers in that. We've launched 2 digital empowerment centers in a couple of our states and are looking to do more. These are places where members of the community can come and learn about everything from how to fix their devices to how to use AI. And the feedback has been clear. They make a difference in our local communities. We have infrastructure partnerships with diverse entities. We've partnered with entities as small as a single township in Oklahoma to fund a single monopole for fixed wireless service. We've partnered with Electric Cooperative in Illinois to bring them substation connectivity and broadband access to their members. We've partnered in open access efforts to drive down mutual cost of infrastructure in Kansas and Nebraska. We have knowledge partnerships with community colleges, training institutions, and are one of the largest providers of connectivity to rural schools in the state of Texas, using both wireless and fiber. And yes, we use AI extensively to drive efficiencies and deliver a better customer experience. And in the market where many potential customers already have something, these kind of investments are how you give them a reason to choose you. Beyond the partnerships, beyond the local investment, the second big piece of how we can make sure that rural communities and rural providers thrive is policy. When you have massive capital expenditures and fewer customers per mile for fiber, every little efficiency can mean the difference between a sustainable and unsustainable network. The big asks that we have in the room today for policymakers are, and for the operators listening in this room and the partners who need to push them, are 3. First, permitting. A rural build can sit for months waiting for NEPA, waiting for Section 106, waiting for all sorts of reviews that for a tower site that disturbs a few feet of dirt, or fiber that runs along poles with no ground disturbance. And every month of permitting delay is a month of carrying cost against a fixed grant budget and a hard milestone. Streamlining these things is critical for the future of rural broadband builds. Shot clocks and things of that nature are going to be absolutely critical. The environment is not more protected by stretching a 30-day review into a 300-day review. Second, pole attachments and access to rights-of-way. These are another massive barrier to further broadband deployment and well-being for rural communities. Make-ready timelines and unpredictable pole costs continue to be the single largest variable in a rural fiber build. The FCC's rules need enforcement, and Congress needs to address some of the loopholes in the Communications Act. A pole that takes 9 months and 3 rounds of price changes is not infrastructure policy, it's a tax on rural deployment. Third, there's the long-term sustainability question that BEAD does not answer. The grant agreements and NTI policy all tell us that for BEAD locations, you're not allowed to take operating subsidies now and into the future. The economics of the most rural fiber locations tell us that that is not great. We're going to need them. Reform of the federal universal service framework, including reform of the contribution base that reflects how Americans actually use connectivity, isn't optional if we want these networks to still be running a decade from now. The build is the easy part. Keeping the network alive is what determines whether a community gets a generation of service or a stranded asset. These are the unglamorous work of making sure that providers who are serving these communities are still here to serve them for decades to come. So BEAD isn't the end of the rural broadband story for those of us who've been in this industry long enough to see that. It's the start, the next chapter of a more competitive one, more providers, more technologies, and customers who in many cases already have something and need a reason to believe that yours is better. And then one more story, one that stays with me. Another young person in Gage County was talking to his father, a farmer, deciding whether to come back home and take over the family farm. And he had 2 questions in mind for his dad. One, does the county allow wind turbines on farmland? I'll explain that one afterwards if you catch me. But the second one was, is there good broadband? Think about that. Broadband's now on the same decision checklist as the nature of the land itself. If a 25-year-old is making a life decision based on whether your service is good enough to build a future on, that's not a technology conversation alone. It's a trust and opportunity conversation. What our experience at NextLink tells us from over 100,000 subscribers across 12 states is that speed may win the click, but reliability and trust win the renewal. I started working on broadband, rural broadband, about 18 years ago. And for me, the biggest lesson across that arc is this, that families don't judge us by our topology charts. They don't judge us based on whether we use XGS-PON or connectorized cables. They judge us based on whether we help them build a life where they live. That's the value proposition that this industry needs. And if we get it right, the next generation of young people deciding whether to come home will have one more reason to say yes. Thank you.